Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. This week we have Karl Widerquist joining us again. Karl is a philosopher with PhDs in economics and political science. He has been studying basic income for decades, and there are very few, if any, aspects of basic income that he doesn't have a perspective on. This week he's here to discuss with us the model for the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend and the lessons we can learn from what they're doing there, and that might help us implement basic income elsewhere. Also joining us is Cliff Groh, and he lives in Alaska and is going to be able to give us some updates about what's been happening there more recently. So welcome to both of you. Karl, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, well, I also have to mention my co-editor, Michael Howard, who contributed a lot to that book, is here too. So I'm sure he'll chime in with things as well. All right, now this is always the start of a Zoom lecture. Is always when you're using PowerPoint. It's always got this little awkward moment. First, I have to share screen. Okay, let's see, share screen, share screen. And then I've got to choose advanced. Then I've got to do portion of screen. Then I have to get this presentation started, then put the presentation on presenter view, and there you have it. Now we're sharing some screen. Now we're ready to start this thing. Okay, so the talk I'm giving is lessons from the Alaska model. I was the news editor for for the U.S. Basic Income Guarantee Network for about 10 or 15 years, and a lot of the biggest news was coming out of Alaska. So I kind of accidentally, in 10 years of following the Alaska dividend and developments, I kind of became like an expert on it all. And so when I got a chance to write a book for Palgrave, one of the first things I thought, well, what we need is a book not just by me, but a book on the relevance of the Alaska Permanent Fund and dividend for the UBI movement, because it had not really been studied from that perspective. There was one article, one unpublished article by Scott Goldsmith on it, and that was really about it. So we assembled people, and we got so much that it ended up becoming two books instead of one: Alaska's Permanent Fund Dividend and Exporting the Alaska Model, both of which came out in 2012. And so I'm bringing to you some of the lessons from that book that in this presentation here. And we have two of the other editors or authors here that can chime in when I miss. Now, basically, what I'm trying to say is that Alaska came to have a small basic income because politicians took advantage of the opportunity, not because Alaska's rich or because they have oil. It's because the right people in the right place, the right time took advantage of the opportunity. This has many positive effects, and it is something that people everywhere, not just in oil-rich countries, can learn from. So let's talk about it. So here's a little bit of the history. In 1959, Alaska became a state, and its constitution has some language in it that doesn't quite say that the land and resources belong to all the people, but it does say that they are to be exploited only for the benefit of the people. So it's the closest thing that any US constitution has of saying the resources of this state belong to the people. And that's important. So we start out from this presumption. And in the 1960s, you might know the history of the UBI movement. There's a very significant growing movement for some form of guaranteed income, mostly in the form of the negative income tax rather than basic income. But this is going on in the 1960s. That's in the background. Now, in 1962, the government, the state government and the federal government had been negotiating for years, since before statehood, how are we going to divvy up the land? What land is going to be state land? What land is going to be federal land? And they couldn't come to an agreement. So it was a meeting between a geologist and the governor in 1962 at the governor's mansion. And the geologist said, I've been looking into this, and there's strong reason to believe that there's lots and lots of oil in the northernmost part of Alaska. And so the the governor says, aha. So he goes to the feds and says, I think I can solve this impasse. Okay, all this federal state land thing. We'll take all of that worthless tundra at the top of Alaska. We'll take a whole bunch of that, and you can have these like forests and things over here and there. We'll do it that way. And the federal government fell for it. And in 1967, sure enough, just like the geologists had predicted 5 years earlier, oil was discovered on that area, in that area. Eventually, the Alaska pipeline was created so they could get that oil down to some ports in southern Alaska, where it is where in Valdez, Alaska, famous for its great oil spill. But that's another story. And the oil revenue started to trickle in the mid-70s. And at that time, Jay Hammond was elected, and he had had some experience with guaranteed income before. He said to me in 2004 that he was influenced by this guaranteed income movement, this desire to eliminate poverty, but he wanted to create something. He, along with a lot of other people, created this Alaska Permanent Fund. And he wanted to change that into something that he called Alaska Incorporated, and which was going to give dividends to everybody. And it was very complicated. And but all they could agree on in the first year of his administration was to create the fund. And it took him 6 years, and really the whole of his administration, to making deal after deal towards getting the proceeds of this fund dedicated to a dividend for everyone. And due to some court issues and some compromises, they ended up making it a basic income in the sense that every resident of Alaska would get it. The only requirement is that you fill out forms to prove you're a resident, which is actually a problem because that's difficult for homeless people, but it's the closest thing to a true basic income that exists in the world today. It's way too small to live on, so it's not the kind of basic income we all want to see, but it's a step in that direction. It is so popular that in a 1998 referendum, that more than 80% of people voted to retain it when elected officials wanted to use the revenue for something else. Now, it's really hard to get 80% of people to vote for anything, but they voted to keep this. In 2008, including a one-time supplement that was added to it, it reached a high of $3,269. That was just before the big stock market crash. They had a lot of income that year. And it says 214. That's a typo. It's actually in 2021, it was only $992. That's because in the last few years, it's been under attack. Okay, how it works. It works with 1/8 of the direct oil income of the state is deposited into the Alaska Permanent Fund. There's actually more oil income that doesn't go into the fund, only 1/8. The rest of it, 7/8 of it, goes to, and the indirect revenue goes into the state's general revenue and is used for whatever else the state buys. The state is prohibited from spending the principal. It's constitutionally prohibited from spending the principal. However, the state, with a simple act of the legislature and the signature of the governor, can redirect the returns. The returns were used exclusively for the dividend, but for 30 years, and only recently as they've started directing some of those funds elsewhere. After inflation protection, returns are shared between all citizens in form of the permanent fund dividend. One thing to know in Alaska that outsiders don't realize, it's not the APFD, it's not the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend. There are two things that are considered separate. The Alaska Permanent Fund, that's the investment fund, that's the APF, and the permanent fund dividend, that's the dividend that's generated from the funds. That's the PFD. The PFD is the basic income. The fund is how we get it. It has been, by all measures, an enormous success, hugely popular. It has helped, during the height of it, it helped Alaska be one of the most equal states and have one of the lowest poverty states, while poverty was growing and inequality was growing in the rest of the country in the 1990s. It was shrinking in Alaska. It's not thought of as being a welfare policy for those other bad people. It's thought about something that we all own, and it has influence around the world. About 10 years ago, in Mongolia, people were out in the streets demonstrating for they wanted their Alaska dividend from some gold and other mining revenues that they were getting. And people have talked about it for Norway, they've talked about it for Iraq, they've talked about it for really any place with a lot of income. A lot of resource income, people have talked about it. So what I want to share with you is 6 lessons that Michael and I, Mike Howard, who's in on this talk, that Michael and I learned from our studying of this. And we co-wrote a chapter in this, in one of these books, talking about these lessons. And this talk is based on those lessons. First, for reasons I've said above, resource dividends are popular and they work. Once they're in place, it wasn't easy to get this in place, but once it's in place, it's popular and it works. A tax on it has been under attack in the last 5-10 years, but the tax have been incremental. That's the way you attack a popular policy. You don't just say, let's get rid of it. You say, let's take this little piece out of it. Let's take another piece out of it. You attack popular policies a little bit at a time, make it less significant for people, and over time, then you can destroy it. That's what they're trying to do right now with Social Security. Whenever they say, oh, let's privatize Social Security, they're trying to chip away at a piece of it so you'll care less about it. That's the way they've been attacking our public school system, by devoting money to charter schools. They're trying to chip away at something that's actually very popular. That's what's going on in Alaska. Now, another lesson to be learned here is you don't have to be resource rich to have a resource dividend. Alaska is not that rich. Alaska, at the time we were writing, ranked 10th out of America's 50 states plus the District of Columbia. And Alaska didn't use most of its oil wealth for its PDF, or for the APF or the PFD. It used most of that revenue to give a tax cut to high income people. They had a progressive income tax system, and they got rid of it entirely. There's no income tax in Alaska to this day. That's what they did with most of their revenue. They took a temporary revenue and used it for a way to get rid of a permanent revenue stream. They knew that this revenue was only coming in temporarily, and still they just used it to give whoever happened to have high incomes in Alaska a big tax cut. Another reason that resource dividends, you don't have to be resource rich to have a resource dividend, is all countries have valuable resources. All countries have valuable resources. What distinguishes Alaska from other countries is Alaska is rich in the type of resources that governments usually charge when they give them to corporations. Everywhere is rich in the type of resources that governments usually give away for free. These include land, forests, minerals, the money creation system, the water system, where governments will just let bottled water companies bottle water for free, often without even filtering it, sell it to you at a premium, and without paying a thing for the water tables of ours that they are depleting. The broadcast spectrum, which has enormous rental value, give it away for free. Clean air, clean water, and clean land. Many companies are allowed to just dump pollutants and greenhouse gases into our environment, making us all worse off without paying anything for it. I estimated that had the whole of Alaska's revenue gone into gone into the APF, and they kept the income tax, that by now Alaska would have a basic income large enough to live on. And one author in the book, Gary Flomenhoff, estimated that Vermont, a so-called resource poor state of Vermont, had enough from resource value alone, well, resource and rent value alone, that it could fund probably enough to live on or close to it. Another lesson is look for opportunities. Alaska has the permanent fund because Jay Hammond was the governor at, well, no, permanent fund was going to happen anyway. The permanent fund dividend is what Jay Hammond fought for. He had a few allies in the state legislature. It was mostly him driving it, and he fought and made deals for years to get that. There was not even a huge movement. There was no grassroots movement for it. He fought for it. The right people at the right place, the right time took advantage of it. Thinking of opportunities to do this is when we should do it. Like about 20 years ago, the United States gave away a new portion of the broadcast spectrum to digital broadcasters. Gave it away for free, didn't charge them a thing. Had the right people been in the right place at the right time, or activists been pressuring this. And like, this is not just some technical thing where we're changing where people broadcast, that this is a government giveaway and this should be charged for. That is taking it away. Another lesson, lesson 4, think like a monopolist. You're going to worry, oh, well, what if we have a dividend? Then aren't people just going to want to sell all the resources so they can get all the revenue to get the revenue and maximize that? Well, that doesn't happen. I never got a revenue for all that tar and I'm breathing in and all those pollutants I've been breathing in and eating and drinking all my life. I never got a revenue for it. I never got a dividend from that. But once you do that, but when you charge for it, when you realize when you're not just selling these, but we're selling resources as a monopolist, then you realize we're going to jack up the price. And we're going to jack up the price as high as we can to at least to maximize profit. And we're going to jack up the price, and we're going to sell less. And we're going to sell less and restrict supply so we can get a higher price. This is how monopolists think. They don't think about selling all you can at a low rate. And I think we should go beyond most monopolists. We've got to think not like any monopoly. We've got to think like Johnny Carson. All right. Who's Johnny Carson? Johnny Carson, 40 years ago, was the highest paid entertainer in the world. He was host of NBC's Tonight Show, which was the most popular show on late night TV. And he had this huge audience that he could take to any network. And his network knew it, that he could, and so they paid him what he asked for. And then he decided he's making all this money. He's working 5 days a week, and he's working maybe a month off a year. And he says, oh yeah, on top of that salary increase I'm demanding, now I only want to work 4 days a week. And I want like 3 months off a year. You can get a guest host or something. I don't care what you do. I'm taking this time off. He did that. And that was beyond, that cost him money to do that. He wasn't selling all that he could. He wasn't even raising it to the profit maximizing place. He realized my time is my resource, and my resource is valuable for things other than selling it. So I'm going to raise my price above the profit maximizing way and use my resource for other things that I enjoy. Once we, the citizens, realize that we are the owners of the resources and we start asserting that ownership, we can do a lot of other things that don't necessarily maximize profits. We can say, okay, not only if you're going to privatize this resource, but if you're going to privatize this resource, you're going to follow all these regulations, all these health, safety, and environmental regulations. We're the owners. We can impose that. You don't want to buy it? Okay, don't buy it. You don't want to buy the resources we're selling? Okay, do without resources. See how far that gets you. But also, then we can raise the price beyond the profit maximizing level and have bigger parks and have a healthy, safer, cleaner environment and start reforestation, have cleaner rivers, have cleaner streams, have cleaner oceans, have cleaner air. All of this we can do if we treat our resources the way Johnny Carson treated his time. Finally, build a constituency. A universal program like basic income, like the Alaska Permanent Fund, that is large enough to make a difference in people's lives, builds a constituency and resists attacks. Got to make it worth defending. If you have a little small gimmicky program and somebody wants to cancel it, they say, okay, no big deal. It's maybe easy to get the foot in the door that way, but it's also a lot easier to get canceled. When it's a big, significant program, they can chip away at it, but it's hard to cancel it all in one go. And the final lesson is avoid creating an opposition. There, you see Ronald Reagan and you see Sarah Palin. Ronald Reagan was, of course, an opponent, and they're both considered these arch conservatives. Ronald Reagan was an opponent of everything the government did to help people, because he saw it as a tax on the rich, and also he saw it as a tax. It would tax the rich, and he didn't care about the poor people. He cared about those poor rich people that had to pay those higher taxes. All of those rich people were his natural constituency because they didn't want to pay the taxes for the programs that help people. And so there's all of those programs have a natural opposition. But the permanent fund has no natural opposition because it's once the money has been taxed and put in the fund, that money belongs to the government. It's just theirs. It's not like we're continually taking from people who we call owners. We're saying we own this collectively. You want some of this, you got to come to us. You're not really an enemy there. And so even an arch conservative like Sarah Palin is so proud to say that she supports the permanent fund. Now, you got to avoid creating an opposition, but also one thing we learned from the recent experience in the Alaska Fund, which we did predict in the book, is that it's not, even if it has no natural opposition, it's a big pile of money that politicians would always like to expend. What politicians like to do is use money to reward their friends and inflict their enemies. They want to do that with every bit of revenue that they have. And they always want to get their hands on it. Now, if they've got some constituency that also doesn't like that money, then that backs them up. There's no constituency there that's in opposition, but there's always greedy hands who want it. And so the Alaska Fund, as we said in the book, was only be as safe and sound as long as, even though it is safe and sound on its own, if the state budget was not sound, it would always be tempting to take from the permanent fund rather than to tax people for the revenue that the state needs. And that is what has really brought Alaska under attack. People find it so much easier to take from this than to introduce the income tax, which Jay Hammond admitted it was a big mistake of his to agree to getting rid of the getting rid of the income tax. He said he should have lowered it, but never gotten rid of it. So that is a quick, but not quick enough, introduction to the Alaska Permanent Fund and dividend. Cliff, you got anything you want to add there? I will end the show.
Sure, and thank you, Karl. Yeah, we're in deep trouble here. Both in the short run, but even more so in the long run. In the short run, this week, the legislature is having enormous difficulty in a special session to come up with a budget for the next year, and it's the size of the dividend that's holding it up. And the two choices are between $1,100 and $525.
Oh,
and the underlying problem is what you described. The two things we needed in addition to the system we helped set up, and I played a key role in setting it up as the principal legislative assistant, the person who worked the most on creating the permanent fund dividend when it was adopted in 1982, when I worked for the Alaska legislature. The two sort of big holes now are, number one, there's not a protected revenue stream. It's a statute which sets the level of the dividend each year, and under Alaska law, and I think generally Anglo-American law generally, the legislature is not bound by its own statutes in the sense that it can adopt a new one to supersede it. And so, as you said, there is a statutory formula on the books for setting the dividend. It has not been followed. The last year it was followed was 2015. So since starting in 2016, it's not been followed each year. What has happened is, more recent years, is the legislature and the governor have negotiated over the size of the dividend, and the legislature has voted on it. This has created a bandwidth problem that it's very difficult for the legislature to do anything else but figure out what the level of dividend is. That's one set of problems. Another set of problems is that oil revenues have collapsed over the last 8 years due to a combination of a much lower Alaska oil production. We used to have more than 2 million barrels a day of oil go through the pipeline. Now we're below 500,000 barrels a day. Secondly, oil prices are well below their previous highs. And third, in 2014, sort of at the peak of like higher oil money, the state of Alaska adopted an oil tax system, which makes it the revenue is much more vulnerable to drops in oil prices, which we've had. So we add that all up, we now don't get much oil money. The entire Alaska system worked by having large amounts of new oil money arrive in the state's coffers each year. That does not happen anymore. It hasn't happened for about 8 years. As a result, the state has cut its budget very substantially. It's argued, some would always say you could cut more. Using this most standard definition, the unrestricted general fund, it's been cut 43% in the last 8 years. The new budget has not yet been signed, but it was been voted on this week. But we don't have new revenues. As you put it out, Karl, we're still trying to make it on the oil revenues, plus spending permanent fund earnings in a sustainable way, which is now over 60% of the unrestricted general fund budget. But the problem is when you add up what the state, Alaskans want to have, roads, schools, public safety, and dividends, you can't make it work with the amount of money we have. You either have to overspend from the permanent fund, reducing the nest egg for the future, spending unsustainably. You have to cut the budget more than Alaskans really want to have it cut, or you have to bring in new revenues, which through taxes, which the state legislature has so far refused to do. So we're in deep trouble. And I want to say one other thing. We have one of the smallest populations of any state, one of the 5 smallest populations, a little over 700,000 people. But we have by far the most complicated fiscal politics in the country, I'm convinced. The existence of the permanent fund dividend, oil taxes, and the permanent fund itself together, make the fiscal politics in Alaska more complicated than Massachusetts, where I went to college, spent a little time, more complicated than the way more larger state of California, where I went to law school. I'm convinced more complicated than New York or Pennsylvania, Ohio, take your pick. So it's a very complicated situation here. And there's also, I would add, some very big regional splits and racial splits. And you add all that up, and it's an enormous problem here in Alaska. I spend most of my time working on it. I tell my friends, they say, what do you do now, Cliff? And I say, well, I've made it my job to try to save the state, and you can see what a good job I've been doing.
That's good job.
They're like a confession.
Good one, Cliff.
I try.
All right. So I see Neil has his hand up, but I'm going to ask a question first, which is,
Sure.
To what extent could Alaska implement some of the lessons from Karl to shore up its dividend and maybe start using some of these other resources or other ways besides oil in particular to kind of bolster that system?
I think to an enormous extent. It could tax land value. The land in the cities is becoming pretty valuable in some of the cities there. It has other mining. It has fisheries. It has forestry. It has a lot of things a lot of resource revenue that haven't been taxed in this way. And the world really needs pollution taxes and pollution dividend, including carbon taxes. But carbon is really only one of the many pollutants that needs to be done. That could be done at a state level. All of those things are just ripe for it. And it doesn't happen partly because there's not a big enough movement for it, but also partly because the interests that that own the right to take all of the government resources for free are so rich and powerful, and our system that really represents money more than it represents voters.
All right, that makes sense. And Neil, your hand is down, but if you want to ask your question, you can.
So I will. If the United States has a basic income, at the present time, a capacity utilization rate of industries is only 70%, and the natural place at which capacity utilization is stable is about 90%. This means that people are willing to just make more of goods without building anything and with very few people, because we have automation. So this also means that the government could simply give away money up to a point, who knows what it is, and it would not create inflation, and that therefore there would, and I assume since nobody's getting taxed, that would be pretty popular. As long as people finally see that there is no inflation, that in the present situation, you do not get inflation until you give away an awful lot of money.
Wow. That's fascinating. If you have a link to a source explaining that in greater detail, please put it on the chat.
Okay. Was there? Yeah. Okay. So Bethany, go ahead.
Yeah, so Karl, you started to get at some of this question, but I have a question about the different kinds of incentive impacts of these different kinds of taxes. So I guess one is positive, as you pointed out, like if you tax pollution, it would reduce pollution. But I wonder if there are any others that we should be thinking about, positive or negative. So I'm thinking about the fact that, for example, Alaska is kind of an odd state in the sense that it's very far away from other states in the United States, and it's really cold a lot of the places and stuff. So I don't know, there could be maybe they're trying to keep taxes really low for businesses to attract them there, because otherwise it's kind of like not that attractive. But on the other hand, obviously a higher kind of basic income for people would attract a population there. So those are just a couple of examples, but I'm wondering if you've thought of any other kind of effects that these types of revenue streams could have, pro or con for the state or for our country.
Well, that's one of the great things. I mean, the reason that rent and resource taxes are so important in economics is that they are considered economically neutral. Economically neutral in the sense that they don't have substitution effects, they only have income effects. So right now, the tax on land value is really, really low. It's much that than if the government was the ultimate landlord, it would be charging people. It's really low. And when you raise that rental fee to the landlords, you get, and if it's tied to, well, what is the actual value of the land? What you're doing is then you're taking a stream of what we call unearned income, which we call rents in economics. I'm trying to explain this without getting too technical. You're simply taking this money. We pay money for land because it's scarce. And we're going to pay that to somebody because we have to ration it. We ration it by charging for it. So when you take the land value stream and you take it from the landlords and give it to the government, you don't change anybody's incentive. All you do is lower the income of the landlords and increase the income of the government, which if they want, they can pass that on to the people through lower taxes on other things, or pass it on to the people in the form of a basic income or services or whatever else. But you don't give them any incentive to change their behavior to evade the tax or to get the tax. You do have income incentives. Oh, I can't make as much money. I've been owning this resource, I don't make as much money off it. I might want to sell it, but then, well, you got to sell it to somebody else who wants the resource making that money. The resource is just sitting there trying to make money. Maybe it'll reduce speculation and things like that. So these are particularly good taxes if you want to take incentives account. And also if you want to take into account that we have made the landlords rich, we've made the bankers rich, we've made the oil companies rich by just giving them things and letting them live off these streams of rental income, off these assets that we created and just gave to them. And maybe we really don't want people who are just so filthy rich off of these extremes of income that would exist no matter who owned them. Even if they don't add anything to it. If you own stuff, you get a stream of income, from it. That's one of the things that I really stress about economic justice. Our system does not reward people who do stuff. It rewards people who own stuff. The big money is all in owning stuff, not in doing stuff.
That's interesting about the incentive neutrality of these resource taxes. Something else that's interesting about them is that if a landlord is earning a bunch of money through rent and then they have that revenue stream, they're not necessarily going to spend their money in the same way as an ordinary consumer might. So if you take that stream and distribute it to ordinary consumers, that might be fine at kind of like the microeconomic level, the level of an individual state or something like that. But then once you get to kind of the level of the whole country, I'm wondering what the macroeconomic effects of that might be, because suddenly you have more consumers who have money to spend, more ordinary consumers who have money to spend. And that feels like it doesn't necessarily trade off or it doesn't necessarily balance one for one with the revenue stream you're taking from the landlords. Is that right?
Oh yeah, what people will about the income effects will have enormous effects. They're considered efficient in the way economists measure efficiency. But so you take away these huge streams of income, and maybe I know people in the oil industry or people who work for people in the oil industry. I know a family that makes lots and lots of oil revenue, and they have a prop jet. They have a prop jet that they share with other people, so they can fly. From a small airport here to a small airport there. They can do it on vacation and stuff like that. Maybe they'll decide to sell their prop jet, and maybe a lot of people are going to sell their jets and their private. And so we'd have a lower lower amount of private jet fuel use, which is actually a good thing. It's so wasteful to be using such enormous amounts of such a polluting thing just for the whims of the very wealthy people. We get less of that if they have less disposable income. I could go on with lots of examples of stuff like that. Hiring people. I talked to somebody who used to work on a yacht where they had to make dinner for the yacht owners every night, just in case the yacht owners decided not to eat somewhere else. And most of the time they just ate the meal later or had to throw it out.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can come up with a lot of examples like that of rich people wasting resources or using up excessive resources. But I think it's still true that on a per dollar basis, rich people are going to use fewer resources than poor people. But as Neil is pointing out in the chat and kind of related to his comment from before, that if you have the resources to support, more consumer spending, then you can, it's like printing money without printing money, right? You found money that people weren't going to spend, and now you're giving it to people who are going to spend it, and that's okay if your economy has room for that, if you have the productive capacity. So the next question I wanted to ask is related to something Cliff said, where he said that the fiscal structure and situation and politics and everything in Alaska is more complicated than everywhere else, partly because of this permanent fund dividend. So I'm wondering if there's a way to do this, or how you guys would think about doing this without making the fiscal situation too complicated in place. Could Alaska be doing this in a way that's simple, that has simpler fiscal politics, or if we wanted to do it somewhere else, is there a way to do it more simply?
Well, the simplest thing you can do in Alaska right now is reintroduce the income tax or sales tax. That's the simplest thing you can do. The more complicated things are, look at what kind of resource value it have, and why haven't we treated this resource value the way we've been treating our oil wealth for the last 50 years. Probably Michael or Cliff want to add to that. I'm not sure.
I'll start. Alaska killed it's broad-based tax, which raised the individual and personal income tax, which raised up, which was the mainstay of Alaska's fiscal system before it got repealed in 1980, and it's never brought it back. The income tax is unpopular in Alaska. I've analyzed this a lot, I think for a couple of reasons. People wildly overestimate what they would pay. They think that they would pay the same amount as they would pay the federal income tax, right? They just think they would write a check to the state of Alaska the same as to the IRS. They also, an income tax, unlike a sales tax, is paid all year. It's paid often in one check by a lot of people, whereas a sales tax, by contrast, is paid all year round. And people in the classic nickel and dimes formulation don't I see it as much. And frankly, I would be more honest here with this national audience that I usually am, or international audiences that I usually am in Alaska. Our current governor has lied and flagrantly won through a lie based on our way our fiscal system works and what's possible, and it's got people convinced that we can pay giant dividends without having other revenues. And the Alaska fiscal system worked better when you had, like you keep saying, large amounts of new oil revenue coming in. If you didn't have it fixed in the Constitution, and you don't have large amounts of oil revenue coming in each year, you get into this four-way fight. That's what makes Alaska fiscal politics so complicated, between people's concerns about what they fear the most. There's a group of people in Alaska most fear the reimposition or reinstatement of broad-based taxes, particularly a personal income tax. There's a group of Alaskans who most fear further cuts in the budget. There's another group, and by that, the budget, I mean conventional public services, teacher salaries, roads, public safety. And then there's a group of Alaskans who's most afraid of having permanent fund dividends cut more. And there's another group of Alaskans who's most concerned about overspending from the permanent fund and having the real value of the permanent fund decline and shrink. And this creates this extremely complicated situation and a very complex politics that it would have been better if I'd had more foresight. I've been called on Twitter by a Time Lord or a wizard by what I saw coming up, partly because of the book, this material I wrote for Karl and Mike's book, and also for an article I wrote back in the early 80s, right the year after the dividend was created. But folks, I wish I'd seen more. I wish we'd had a more prescient system set up, because the system got set up years ago is not fit for purpose today. It's not working, and it's causing enormous contortions and problems to deal with that now.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, just a quick question for Cliff. Isn't it contrary to the Alaska Constitution to actually spend the principal from the fund?
Right, but you can spend the earnings, and it's the earnings from which more than 60% of the state budget is financed now, right? And all the spending, including both the conventional public services and the dividend. But even with spending, and that system started in 2018. Before 2018, there was no substantial spending of permanent fund earnings for anything but for permanent fund dividends or for inflation proofing, making the putting money back into the principal fund to make it whole. But since starting about 2014, as I said before, oil revenues have collapsed, and so there's an attempt to use permanent fund earnings to replace oil revenues, but the oil revenues have collapsed so much that even a sustainable use of the permanent fund earnings to support the budget does not pay for all the things that Alaskans want. And so this just creates, like I said, a mess. And the best way to understand it is, I frequently say this, in every other state and probably every other country, fiscal politics is essentially a wrestling match between two sides. Like taxpayers and budget beneficiaries. The way to understand Alaska now, it's like an airplane where there is a standoff in a cockpit, with at least three people pointing guns at each other. And so the plane is either out of fuel or maybe both out of fuel and also on fire, running out of fuel and on fire. And so that explains this just the extremely complicated and messed up situation that our state is in now. That could have been avoided if we had, fixed the size of the dividend in the Constitution, and frankly also had additional revenues for the days that the large amounts in oil revenues stopped happening, which have, and are frankly not coming back. We used to have 2 million barrels of oil a day go through the pipeline. We'll never get back to 1 million barrels of oil, and a lot of people are unhappy in Alaska about this. But all this climate change is, made the more expensive oil projects in particular harder to pull off, and projects on Alaska's North Slope where the oil is tend to still be, high cost. That's just the way the world works, and because the oil is far from market and it's expensive to get out of the ground.
So it seems like they're going to have to reinstate the income tax, preferably, or at least the sales tax eventually. So is the problem, nobody wants to step out and be the first person to advocate that because people will vote them out of office.
There's that. Well, I ran for office in 2018 on the platform Bring Back the Income Tax, and I'm not a legislator now. I would point out, did not get elected. May run again, who knows? Got my flashy new mustache of justice working for me. See if that would help. But I would also point out that there was an attempt on the ballot last year, a citizen initiative to raise oil taxes, and that failed. And so what some other proposed solutions are harder to pull off. And additionally, and this is not, what a lot of people, I predicted this back when I wrote for those books in 2012. There is an element of this. There's a group of state legislators and a group of Alaskans that would rather zero out the dividend, eliminate the permanent fund dividend, rather than pay taxes at all. And they are a smaller group of Alaskans in some ways, but they punch above their weight because, they're a lot of some campaign contributors think that way. And although Alaska does not have as many high-income people as a state like New York or California, I personally have had coffee with a man who made $5.5 million in net income from work in Alaska only. He was a neurosurgeon. But what particularly irritated me is he didn't pay a penny in broad-based taxes, and he moved from Washington State, cut his workload substantially, and made almost 4 times as much money. That's another problem is that the attrition in Alaska in the last 20 years, particularly especially physicians and surgeons, have made out like bandits because of the reimbursement rules and some other factors. So a lot of the highest income people tend to be in the medical community. But there are some, like I said, I've met some.
I could just make one more comment. When Karl was talking about what could have happened if they'd taxed all of the minerals, not just oil, at a rate that could be sustained, and put it all toward dividends. The one thing Karl didn't mention, but he also had proven, was that the current amount of the dividend, at least the time we published the book, would be $18,000 per person. Correct me if I'm misremembering that. That's really right. Astonishing, but that's the tragic thing that was lost by doing away with the income tax, and having a much smaller amount going to the fund and funding state government. Basically, rich people got away with these enormous tax breaks, and now people have a relatively small dividend being eaten away, and there's much less that's commonly owned by Alaskans and much more that's owned by private individuals.
Yeah, I did say that. However, I didn't advocate that because actually they did need to use some of that money at the time for infrastructure spending. Say for the future when you don't have good schools for everybody, but that was one possible. That is, they really maximize the fund. That's where they could be at. But if you even think of them only use $6,000 off of that, you get a lot of money for infrastructure spending, and you still got a pretty substantial basic income.
Bethany, do you have a question?
Yeah, I had a couple. So one question I had that I guess you guys have been getting at a little bit is there any kind of foot in the door effect where once you have some kind of basic income in the way you had in Alaska, people might be more willing to seek other revenue streams to try to supplement it as the original revenue stream decreases? What I'm hearing is that instead of that, people are highly reluctant to adopt any new taxes and are more willing to let go of the income than the taxes. And what I'm also hearing is that this is probably because of the outsized influence of really wealthy people. So maybe my question has kind of been answered, but I'm still interested, in whether there's this any evidence in Alaska that people are more willing to kind of do things to sustain the permanent fund once it's established, and is there any hope there for kind of opening up other revenue streams?
Well, as far as I know, there hasn't been any major movement in that direction in Alaska. You have some, few thinkers like Cliff and some of his colleagues who are thinking along those lines, but not a major movement. And the experience in Alaska has not shown it, has not shown that to happen. However, it certainly could. I think if you had a leader, that was pushing for, if you had a leader that was pushing for, let's do that with our gold revenues, and let's do that with our fishing and forestry revenues. If you had a leader pushing those things, I think the Alaska Fund and dividend would have made it a lot easier for that leader to push it. But in the absence of that leadership at the really high levels or a strong activist group doing it, that sales opportunity was lost.
So at this time, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, once the revenue, once these resources have been given away, it's very hard to claw them back. You see that with the electromagnetic spectrum, for example.
Yeah.
One opportunity, this could happen at a state level, but I think the potential is even greater at the federal level, is with carbon taxation, because currently nobody really owns the atmosphere. And some of the bills that have come and gone before the legislature have proposed giving these credits away, but it would be much better to auction them off or to put a tax on the revenue and make that a common resource. If you get it before it's owned by anybody, then you have a better chance of doing something like the Alaska model.
Yeah, if they discover some new mining in Alaska, they might think of it. But the political resistance to doing the stuff that we've already given away for free is enormous. And it's since we're not a true democracy, but one where money has more power than voters, it's really hard to reverse that.
So one of the key things then that makes oil something that the type of resources that a government usually charges for is that it's newly discovered. So you get to decide what to do with it. Whereas some of these other things, the cat's kind of already out of the bag, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Or the boat has sailed. Yeah, go ahead, Cliff.
I would note a couple things. I wrote my thesis in college, my senior honors thesis, on the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. Before, a few years after it was passed in 1971, before the dividend I worked in creating the dividend. But that same phenomenon allowed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act to be passed, that later allowed the permanent fund and the permanent fund dividend to be created, which is what you were saying, Alex, which is one of the professors who graded the thesis said, the discovery of oil at Prudhoe Bay and Alaska's North Slope was like finding gold on the moon, right? In the sense that nobody expected it, and so that was, it was not claimed the same way. I would also note, and I share, do not have a economics degree or research some of the economics literature as much as some of the other people on this call. But it's widely understood that at its peak, and for a lot of its history, oil was not so much now, but oil was just so much more valuable, generated so much more rent than some of the commercial fishing and the timber, right? And so there was more potential there. There is a big mine prospect in Alaska. It's called the Pebble Mine. It's in southwest Alaska. It's very rich. It also sits on top of the richest salmon fishery in the world, and it looks like it's probably not going to happen. But there was some discussion, like Karl suggested, of trying to use Pebble Mine, for some sort of resource scheme, or plan or distribution of revenues, and that in direct distribution that did not happen because it does not look like that mine is going to happen, basically for economic reasons. But there is a lot of environmental opposition as well.
Yeah. So Austin was asking a question on the YouTube chat. Actually, he said, can you guys point us to something that proves causality between the dividend and equality levels?
Well, I don't remember if there were causality studies, but it is some things. There might be some. I'm not sure, but there some things of it are really kind of true by definition. When you have an income that goes to everybody, that has a much more profound effect on you the less you have. And when it's being financed by this resource revenue that would be going to create enormous concentrated forces, those two things really by definition are increasing equality. And the same as if it's a lump sum payment, so there's no reason to think that a lot of other things are going to change, as what we were talking about before. So if you took this money away, you would expect poverty to increase by the people who are living in or near poverty. You would expect it to drive a lot of people into poverty. So some of the causal effect on inequality and poverty, it doesn't really need a lot of empirical investigation to show that it's true. And really, the higher the taxes on the rich and the higher the basic income, the more what I'm saying is going to be true. The more it's going to decrease poverty and increase equality.
Okay, and then final question from Austin. He's noticed that since the coronavirus crisis, the federal government has been buying state bonds, and that's kind of true in other countries as well, including Australia. So then the question is, does that move us closer to a scenario in which individual states can maybe, like on your slide, you had money creation as one of the potential resources. Does that move us closer to that? Could a state like Alaska or one of the other states simply borrow more and sell their bonds to the central bank and pay for a dividend that way?
Well, if they can count on the feds buying those bonds, yes. But even then, if the state buys the bonds, if the central government buys the bonds, the state still legally has to come up with a stream of income to pay the rent, to pay the returns on those bonds. I'm not sure that's very wise for the state to do. The state doesn't have the power and flexibility that the government does to just run a permanent deficit without borrowing or raising taxes to finance some portion of it. So I think the state should really stay away from that as much as possible. When there's of course situations when it's not possible, but they should focus on, well, at least if we lived in a democracy where everybody had an equal voice instead of rich people having a stronger voice, it should focus on what can we do to get revenue from the people who control our resources and the people who use up most of our resources, the wealthiest and the highest income people. That's, I think, what state government should be focusing on.
So how do we get revenue from resources that we are currently giving away for free and maybe shouldn't be?
It's really easy. It's well, economically speaking and technically speaking, it's really easy. You just introduce a tax on it. Politically, that's difficult because that small number of people who own that stuff and who will be harmed by that very small number of people will resist it. And they have tools to get a lot of other people on their side. The political barrier is not something that I'm an expert in, but the actual technicality, the technical aspect of it is really easy.
All right. So that sounds like that's what our challenge is, the politics of making that happen somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this was a great discussion. We're getting to the end of our hour. Are there any final thoughts that you want to give, Karl or Michael?
I just wanted to point out that the North American Basic Income Guarantee Congress is happening this week, and both Karl and Alex will be speaking in a session on Friday. So I encourage people to check that out.
Yes, moderated by you.
Yeah.
Moderated by me. That's right.
Yep.
And it'll be the three of us talking about completely different topics. I don't think Alaska will even come up during the discussion. But yeah, there's 3 days of basic income talk emanating from New York. Sorry, tomorrow, Friday, and Saturday. So check out the schedule. Just Google U.S. Big Conference or NABIG Conference. NABIG stands for North American Basic Income Guarantee. Google that, find the links, and look at the schedule. And if you have any interest in basic income, there's going to be something on that list
something like
that's going to interest you.
120 different presenters speaking over the course of the next few days. So definitely check that out if you're interested. Karl and I are going to be at 11 a.m. on Friday. So that's obviously the most important one. That's the one you should go to if you really have to choose.
Also, if you're a regular viewer of Boston Basic Income, you can, it might be interesting to you to see Alex where he doesn't control the microphones and everything. So he'll be subject to Michael's control.
Oh, no.
And so to watch, instead of Alex being the guy holding the leash, he's going to be the guy on the leash.
Yeah, that'll be interesting for me too. Yeah. All right. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it. Next week, we have economist Jakob Fagan joining us. And he's going to be talking about an article he posted in January entitled "The Deflationary Block" and the political forces behind the kind of global deflationary pressures that we've seen in recent decades. Maybe that's changed a little bit with coronavirus, but we'll get into all of that. So that should be a fun discussion.